Well, Morbius is the second franchise addition, I believe, to Sony's pocket dimension of the MCU, but does it give reason to put hope in where Sony is headed with these properties? Stick around and I'll share my thoughts at least. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. This is my uncut review of Morbius. The synopsis on IMDb reads, biochemist Michael Morbius tries to cure himself of a rare blood disease, but he inadvertently infects himself with a form of vampirism instead. This is based on the Marvel Comics character in Spider-Man's peripheral cast. He's an anti-hero in the comics who's been a tragic Spidey villain, but also heroic in other ways. This movie could almost feel like a modern, stylish vampire action story, like kind of akin a little bit to the Underworld movies, although it leans more into style and kind of cool quote-unquote action over true horror and gore, which those movies lean into much more. So this is firmly planted in PG-13 territory. However, it's also much more serious than the Venom movies, which are the only, I believe, other movies that are part of this intended Sonyverse, if you will. And I felt that the Venom movies leaned too hard into comedy, possibly out of a desire to offset the dark horror visual designs. Maybe they felt a need to lean ever harder into the humor, but I didn't care for that. Morbius's tone was more a satisfying middle ground for me, where it's serious but still aiming for style over something truly grounded. I would have preferred the story focus more on Morbius and his friendship with the villain. That seems like the most ripe option for dramatic tension at the heart of this story, but instead precious moments are given to a romantic interest that I didn't think needed to be in the movie at all. The romantic interest character I think could have been totally removed, and the things that she did to serve the plot could have been handled by some other small characters, no-name characters here and there. I think she really wasn't needed here, based on how they leveraged her. So I think that the precious moments given to specific interactions with her really could have been given to this interaction between these two guys who are friends who grew up together. And so it was weird that the romantic interest thing seemed like it was there merely out of obligation to Hollywood convention. Like, this is what you do. You have a romantic interest. But they didn't lean into that romantic interest subplot in a way that motivated me at all to root for that couple to get together, you know? I also would have liked a little more time given to Michael Morbius at the start. We get important bullet points about his personality, but little time is given to fleshing them out through scenes that sort of exemplify his character traits. So I didn't really feel the tragic cost of his self-inflicted curse like I wanted to, because I didn't really know Michael Morbius very well before this massive life change. Still, there's plenty of stylish action that's propelling the movie forward, and so, you know, even though it was falling short for me in drama and story in some ways, I felt like at an hour and 44 minutes it was like a solid experience, but not great, and it didn't overstay its welcome for me. Except maybe just a tad at the end, where the climax is resolved by the use of an ability that I didn't feel was set up well enough to be earned. And there's one other power that Morbius displayed in this movie that also felt somewhat unjustified. It was sort of like, in these instances, okay, I guess you can do that, cool. At some point, tension is lost when the hero can be kind of just given powers right when he needs them with little or no explanation. I'm not saying that I couldn't connect the dots and say, oh, I wonder if he's able to do this because this, you know. So I could connect the dots, but I had to put work in to connect those dots. I didn't feel like they'd really given me the information to really confirm what my headcanon was coming up with. As for Michael Keaton's Vulture, this isn't a spoiler, I don't think, because he appears in at least one of the trailers as a, you know, not as the Vulture, but, you know, as the character, something Adrian Toomes, I think is his civilian name, and he's in Spider-Man Homecoming. Well, he appears in at least one trailer for Morbius, but in the movie, he actually doesn't appear until a post-credits scene that's seemingly meant to establish his connection to what I'm calling the Sonyverse, shared by Venom, Morbius, now Vulture, and possibly, along with the Daily Bugle, which we see copies of, as my son pointed out to me during this movie, possibly a Spider-Man of some kind, which the post-credits scene allows for in dialogue. It leaves open the possibility for. Don't get me wrong, Spider-Man doesn't come swinging in or anything like that, but there's an exchange in the dialogue that doesn't quite confirm or deny that there is a Spider-Man in this world. So it's really open to interpretation by audience members at this point. It seems this movie is intended to start collecting Sonyverse Marvel characters and possibly heading toward a Sinister Six movie, as was originally intended during Andrew Garfield's brief tenure as Spider-Man. But I'm wondering, when the six are assembled by Sony, will it be Garfield or Tom Holland that they go up against? Probably Tom Holland. I think just in terms of marketability, he's the most recent Spider-Man, but Andrew Garfield would be awesome. Of course, I'll only really get what I want if Sony continues to add more gravity and seriousness to their Sonyverse Marvel movies, as Morbius seems to begin stepping in that direction. But put a big we'll see on it in my book. As far as the cast and performances, the cast was all fine with some very familiar faces, but the script or maybe the editing didn't seem to give time and opportunity for the kinds of acting I really would have liked to see. And Jared Leto's Morbius was fine, but I wanted something, I don't know, more tragic or haunting or otherwise more idiosyncratic or compelling in some way, and I didn't quite get that here. As far as stunts and visuals go, they seem to opt for visual effects to represent Morbius and the villain's facial transformations when they looked full-on vampire-y throughout the movie. I'm conflicted in how I feel about them leaning on CG. CG did allow the monster faces to be shaped in ways that, makeup wouldn't allow, because makeup is adding, and not subtracting. And when you're going with something that's like this hollow, undead kind of look, well, then it needs to kind of shrink inward in order to really look convincing. Otherwise, you have to add really extra pronounced cheekbones, and then it just has that makeup-y look to it. But at the same time, they also looked like CG to my cursed eyes. Well, specifically, they moved like CG. I think when they're being still and they're not moving, it was actually pretty interchangeable with makeup and fooling me in that way. Unless they were using some makeup, I don't know. I would have really preferred, assuming this was not the case, that they used makeup with CGI enhancement. So use real makeup, but then just narrow their faces where you want them to be more narrow through the use of CG. Maybe that's what they did, but the CG was just a little bit too hands-on and ended up giving it an animated kind of look. I don't know, but there's a signature effect that I would describe as this smoky vapor surrounding Morbius as he leaps and jumps and does all of his cool vampire-y things. And the vapor matches the color of Morbius's clothes. So it looks cool and stylish when it does that, but I never understood conceptually what was happening or how bat DNA would result in this admittedly cool-looking effect. There's also nice use of bullet-timey style slow motion. There's nothing groundbreaking or truly striking to me in the visuals here, but they looked cool enough to satisfy me in a one-time viewing experience. As far as themes, is there anything of moral, philosophical, or spiritual significance going on in the themes of this thing that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation? The villain is someone who was disabled for most of their life, mistreated, made fun of, and outcast by their peers. When they finally come to a position of power, they take vengeance on everyone they encounter to seemingly make up for lost time and just kind of get everything from life they feel entitled to. In fact, it's not even necessarily a vengeance. It's just like, listen, other people don't matter. I'm just in pursuit of what I want. If they get in my way, then I'll pour out my wrath on them or whatever. But it just seems to be a disregard for the value of people around him, and he's living out his most self-absorbed fantasies. Many of us geeks have mistreatment or neglect in our history. It's part of kind of our story, maybe still currently in some cases, and living with that can tempt us to develop a sense of entitlement, keeping a record of wrongs and like what we feel we are owed to balance the scales. Because we suffer a certain amount, others should expect to suffer as we claim what we believe we are owed in life. But while there is gross injustice in the world that we've all experienced to varying degrees, we're just not in a position of knowledge to truly and accurately know who deserves what. And we can't truly be trusted to portion out that payback. I think we all kind of know that revenge is wrong, and I think it's really easy to wag our finger at it when it's on such a dramatic scale in fiction like Morbius. Obviously, we look at that and say, oh, he's wrong, that's bad. But on a smaller scale, I think it's harder for us to notice in our own lives. How many times do we neglect doing good? Or how many times do we selfishly pursue our desires out of a quietly bitter attitude of entitlement that's building up inside of us? When I take a hard look at myself, which I think I can only do aided by the assurance of God's tireless forgiveness through Jesus, I have to admit that my ideas of what I deserve lead me to neglect people like my family members, and neglect actions that I should be giving more of myself to. So, I hate to admit it, but sometimes I am the villain in someone else's story, whether they're aware of that or not. Now, I have no idea what your tastes are in movies, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, Peter, rent this one for a couple bucks some night when you want some cool superhuman action. It's not one you're going to want to watch twice, but it's a solid one-time diversion for under 2 hours of your time. It's rated PG-13 for intense sequences of violence, some frightening images, and brief, strong language. And those are all my thoughts for now on Morbius. As always, I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this review possible. You can get info about the benefits of joining over at patreon.com/Spirit Productions. And then, as always, I hope you'll check out the Christian Geek Central podcast. Stay connected to all CGC content over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.